So, of course, I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about advanced sketch tips in Onshape. And really, what we want to do is put together a webinar for those that have spent some time in Onshape and are looking for ways to speed up their sketch design, their sketch techniques, and also better ways to reflect their design intent. And so, really think of this as tips, techniques, best practices, some of the things you should consider after you've spent some time and learned the basics of sketching in Onshape. As I always say with these webinars, I really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question, and I'll do my best to stop and address them. So, as I mentioned, today's topic, advanced sketching tips. Now, real simple, short, brief agenda today. We're just going to walk through as many sketch tips as I can get to in the time period that we have. I think I have about a dozen set aside to go through. Again, feel free to ask any question as we're going through this, and I'll do my best to stop and address the questions from time to time as we get through the webinar here today. All right, now before I get started, there are always a few questions that I have of the audience. I'm always curious of the audience, what kind of users are you? What kind of, how are you using Onshape today? And so one of the first questions I have is, are you using Onshape for professional use, or are you using Onshape for hobbyist use? Or are you interested in using Onshape for professional use? And just curious, it allows me to tailor the presentation to the professional user or the hobbyist user, depending on the audience. So if you would take just a moment to answer that poll, and I'll do my best to move on quickly here. It looks like the majority of our audience is in that professional category, which is awesome. A lot of what we're going to be covering here today is definitely for what I would define as a heavy user, someone that uses Onshape a lot and is looking for ways to speed up sketching. So let's get into it. Now, I want to just go through as many tips as I have, as I can in the time that we have. I don't have them in any specific order, so we're just going to jump right into it and work our way through each tip. And I want to start with left-click drag. And this is something that you'll see in sketching in a few different places. One of the first that I always like to mention is when creating an offset. If you're using the offset command, left-click drag is a big one to know. If you're creating sketch fillets, another example where left-click drag can be a big one to know because it makes it easy to dynamically resize them. Finally, left-click drag align, of course, allows you to create just a single line and not back-to-back lines. Very useful if you just want to draw one line and that's it, left-click drag align, as opposed to just left-clicking. So again, the left-click drag is a technique that you'll use in a few different commands. I'm going to show you an example of a few of them here. So let's jump out of this. I'm going to get into a document, and let's edit a sketch. Now, one of the first things that I want to mention is left-click drag when it applies to a sketch fillet. So if I select the sketch fillet command from the toolbar, if you're familiar with sketch fillet, it's very easy. You can just left-click a point, enter a value for your radius, and it creates a sketch fillet. What a lot of users aren't aware of necessarily is that you can left-click drag a point and dynamically resize that sketch fillet. So instead of left-clicking the point, left-click drag the point, and you'll get a dynamically resizing fillet. It allows you, it's a great way to get it close, so to speak, to the size that you want, let go, and then enter a value. Right, so let's say 2. So then I can enter a value, and I have my sketch fillet. The main tip here is instead of left-clicking the point, you left-click drag the point, and you get that dynamic resize. Now, another sketch fillet tip is that while in the sketch fillet command, after I've placed that first one, I can continue clicking on points, and it will continue adding fillets at that radius. So it's very easy for me to add one radius, and then I know that all these other points also need fillets, and they're all the same size. I can just continue clicking points. It's easy for me to go in and add the fillets. They're all tied to each other, so if I change the dimension of one, they all update. But it's just a very convenient way of adding a lot of sketch fillets of the same size at once. All right, so left-click drag is, again, the big tip. When you left-click drag a point, you get that dynamic resizing sketch fillet. Another example of this is left-click drag in the offset command. So let me take a moment to explain how this works. Let's say, for instance, I wanted to offset all of these lines and arcs, create an offset of the entire chain of sketch entities that I have here. If I select offset and then just left click an individual piece of sketch geometry, I get an offset of just that one piece of sketch geometry. So it's useful if that's all I wanted, or maybe I just want one or two pieces of sketch geometry, I can offset just those individually. But what if I want dozens of lines and arcs that are all connected, and I want to offset them all at once? I don't want to left click each individual entity, or I don't want to window select or do any of those types of techniques. What I'd recommend is left click drag. So there's another example where left click drag makes a big difference. So I select offset. I'm not going to just left click. I'm going to left click drag the entity, and it will automatically grab the entire chain of entities. Again, really useful if you have a lot of geometry that you want to offset at once. You don't want to have to window select or left click individually the pieces. Just left click drag one piece and will automatically grab everything that's connected. So again, left click drag. This is another example where it can be particularly useful in the offset command. Now, the other thing that I mentioned is sketching a line. And this is a simple one, admittedly. So, for those users that have been around a long time, I'm sure you're familiar with it. But I do want to mention it just briefly. In the line command, if I select a line, if I left click and left click, I, of course, get a line. And by default, it assumes that I want to continue sketching lines. And I'm sure users out there are familiar with this functionality. Once you've sketched a few lines, if you left click, it just continues with the line. It makes it easy for me to go on to the next one and to the next one and so on. So if I left click, just like I did, it assumes that I want to continue sketching lines. But what if I only want to sketch one line? And this is another example where left click drag is very useful. So I select line. Rather than two left clicks, I left click, drag my mouse to where I want the line to end, and let go. Okay, so I'm using a left click drag to move the line out to its position. The benefit of this, and it all depends on the scenario, but it does not assume that you want to sketch another line. So if all you're trying to do is draw maybe just a series of single lines that are not connected to each other, this might be another technique that's useful. Okay, again, left click drag instead of two separate left clicks in the line command. All right, so that's my first tip, and that is left click drag. You can use it in the offset command, sketch fillet command. Dragging a line is another good example of it. So a very useful one. The next one on the list is linear patterns, and I don't want to discuss just linear patterns. We have other webinars that discuss patterns and sketch patterns in particular in greater detail. What I do want to discuss is the flexibility of the linear pattern command, because I think it allows you to do a lot of things that users may not be immediately familiar with. So the thing I want to stress is you can create a pattern of sketch geometry very easily, but you can also edit that pattern very easily. And what I mean by that is you can delete instances within the pattern. You can delete the dimension that drives the pattern and redimension it to something else. And all of these things, in that scenario, the pattern remains intact. So the sketch pattern is, you can think of it as, it's creating all this geometry, but it's a very flexible pattern that can be modified later. So let me show you what I mean by this. Let me jump out of this and get into an example here. So in this example, I have a simple arm to a part, and you can see I have this slot sketch, right? Sketch 1 here. You can see I have a simple slot feature. And what I'd like to do is create a linear pattern along the edge of the part here of this sketch geometry. Now, if you haven't created a linear pattern of sketch geometry before, it's very simple. You click the linear pattern command in the toolbar, and you select the geometry that you want to pattern. So I just window selected that slot. And so you can see it now gives me my pattern. Here are my two pattern instances out here in space, and I have these arrows and manipulators that I can grab and drag. In my case, I want to pattern this direction, so we're going to grab the arrow and drag it the other way. And I actually want, let's say, 5 instances. Right, so I'm going to say 5x. I just double click the number. Now I have 5 instances of my pattern. Let's change the spacing a bit here. We'll pull this back a bit. There we go. And now I have 5 more of those instances of my pattern, of my sketch geometry. Now, the linear sketch pattern command can also go in 2 directions, so I can left click the other arrow, drag it, and you can see that will add a second direction to my pattern. And you can go multiple instances of this as well. You can see this is 2x, but I could easily go 3 and 4, whatever I want in terms of pattern geometry. So this is the second direction. In this case, you have the same details. The distance between pattern instances is a dimension here, and the number of instances is a dimension, right? So just keep in mind, when you're doing this, you have all the same controls that you might get if you were to put these together manually. Now, one thing I want to stress, though, is once you've accepted it, it's not done. You can go back and change things. One last thing before I forget. You can also move these squares. So say, for instance, I wanted the pattern to follow an edge that's not, normal to a part, for instance. I can grab this and drag it up. Right, I can align this line with some reference, some other piece of the model, right? So I can create a relationship. Now, I think what most users will do is they will get the pattern close, like I've done here. It's not perfect. This needs to be perfectly horizontal, and so on. Maybe I want these evenly spaced between, the 2 instances on top, something like that. But I know it's not done. The important thing is make sure to accept the pattern, right? You can use the Enter key to accomplish it, or the left click. Again, left click the mouse. You can see the little visual cue there. Then you've accepted your pattern. But again, trying to drive this home, you can then change it any way you'd like. Right? Just because you've accepted the pattern doesn't mean that it's finished. And this means I can delete individual instances. I can window select this one in the corner and say delete that. Right? And now I've deleted one instance. It doesn't impact anything in the geometry. So if I change anything in the pattern, everything updates. So just keep in mind that pattern instance, deleting individual instances doesn't have an impact. You can also change the construction lines that drive the geometry, right? So I can grab the end point of this line and move it, or add a dimension or constraint that ties it to something else. I can also make this edge, for instance, parallel with the line. Right? So that might be a great way to constrain my pattern. Okay? So just keep in mind you have a lot of options when you talk about how patterns work. You can constrain it relative to other things. Essentially, it gives you the sketch geometry you need to then go in and make modifications. So now I've made this line parallel with the bottom edge, which means these slots are all parallel. And I can even come in and say, these slots, the pattern for this slot should be at a 35-degree angle, right? And so now I've fully defined my pattern. Now, one other thing that I want to point out is that you don't have to drive a pattern by the distance between the individual instances. That's how it's going to default. So you'll notice I have a 1.65 dimension here, and I have another dimension for the distance, 0.947. This is how it will, by default, dimension, but you can change this. I can change this to something else. I can delete this dimension and dimension it from the edge, for example. And now, let's say 2.375. Now, instead of being driven by a dumb value, so to speak, between the number, between the instances, just a static number, it's now driven by the length of this arm. So if I change the length of this arm, the pattern is going to behave in a little bit more intelligent manner than it otherwise would, right? Because now it's driven by the overall length rather than just some number, arbitrary number between instances. So again, just driving home, you can delete the dimensions that drive the pattern. You can delete the individual instances of a pattern. You can dimension it just like normal sketch geometry. All those construction lines that are created can be defined just like normal sketch geometry after you've accepted the pattern. So again, that the exception of the pattern, the left click to accept the pattern is really kind of the first step, and then you go back and fully define things, especially in scenarios where you want the geometry to align with an edge of the part, for example. You're going to need to constrain this line to something on your part in that example. All right, so enough on this. I just want to drive home again the linear pattern command. I think that you may have exposure to it, but just realize it has a lot more capability than a lot of users are aware of. All right, so I see a few questions. Was your arm made with Onshape's beta sheet metal tools? Somebody had to ask. No comment. I will say we are very, very close on sheet metal. So if you're interested in sheet metal, stay tuned. Are there any plans for construction history for sketches, similar to construction history for parts? Of course, editing a sketch is a step in the history, but it's not individual pieces. I'm not aware of any plans to make it more granular than that, than edit a sketch and change it. I don't know that you're going to see insert line, rectangle, those types of sets at that granular of a level. Does a slot have a center feature to select? Usually I need to center the slot in 2 dimensions and then need to recalculate from the center radius. I'm fairly certain the answer is going to be no. I'm going to cover slots in just a second, but I think in your example, it's using some other geometry to reference for a slot. So give me a moment, and maybe I'll answer your question when I cover slots. Can you replace the angle dimension in the pattern with an XY offset? Absolutely. Yeah, that's just a preference in how you like to dimension. Sure. How would you do a cutout on a cylinder? A few different ways. Create a plane in the middle of the cylinder and cut from the middle. It's it depends on the scenario. Can patterns be dynamic? As the part length increases or decreases, can pattern instances increase or decrease? And the answer is yes, but it requires some thought. And what I mean by that is there's an example of it. What I'd recommend if you do a lot of this, I want the number of pattern instances to dynamically increase based on the length of a part, and I want that to be automatic. What I'd recommend is on the feature script page, onshape.com/feature script, there is a feature. Forgive me, it's been a while since I've looked this up, so I'm going to have to remember. I forget now which one it is. But there is a feature here that will recognize the distance between them and automatically increment. Measure distance. This is the one. So definitely check out the measure distance. There's an example of it working there. You can copy it. It's a public open document. But measure distance would do what you're looking for in a smart way. It would allow you to intelligently update the number of instances based on the length of a part, for example. Okay. In this example, the example I was giving you a moment ago, the sketch pattern example, I can drive it by the overall length, of course, but I can't say, if it's this, then set the instance count to this. The spacing would change, but not the instance count. Is there a way to get the instance count to be driven? First and last instances are defined by the dimension, and between the changes instance count. The first thing I would try there, and forgive me, I haven't personally tried this, but a variable. But I haven't tried driving a linear pattern instance count by a variable. That would be the first thing that I would try. And then you'd have to establish that the variable itself is driven by maybe the length of the part or whatever factors that you may have. But that would be my first guess, first thing I would go for. All right, moving on. The next tip that I have for you is select constraint first. And this one's a big one if you find yourself adding a lot of the same constraints over and over again. So let's say that I have this sketch and, I need to add 5 tangent constraints, and what a lot of users will do is they'll select the geometry, and then click tangent. Geometry, then click tangent. And so you end up clicking tangent 5 times every time that you create a constraint. So if you know that you're going to create a lot of the same constraint over and over again, a big tip that I have is you can click the constraint first, then click the entities that you want to constrain. And this just means you don't have to go back to the toolbar every time. The command will remain active until you get out of it, until you click the command again or hit the escape key. So the big thing is it's very useful if you create a lot of the same constraint back to back. because you don't have to go back and forth. So let me give you a simple example of this. Let's say I had a situation like this one. And in this situation, I have, actually, you know what? This is defined. Let's create something real simple, right? So I have two circles and I have two lines that join them. And what I really want from these two lines is I want tangent, forgive me there. I want all of them to be tangent. Now, if you're particularly careful, you can actually create the tangency as you're sketching, but let's just say that you haven't and you need to create a tangent constraint between all four transitions, right? Four different tangencies between circle and line, line, circle, circle, line, all 4 points need to be tangent. What a lot of users will do is they will left click, select tangent, right? Tangent from the toolbar, left click, select tangent, left click, select tangent. So I'm going back and forth to the toolbar. So the big tip that I have is click the command first, then click on the entities that you want to constrain. So now I have the tangent command active. Now I can go line, circle, line, circle, line, circle, line, circle. And now I have 4 tangent constraints without having to go back to the toolbar every time to select it. So just keep in mind, it's a big time saver if you find yourself having to do it a lot. And I think for a lot of users, if you do lay out all of your sketch entities all at once and then come back and add all your constraints at once, this is a very valid tip. You'll find yourself having to go back and forth a lot. Question, can you do angular patterns? Yes, we refer to them as circular patterns. You can do circular patterns in Onshape. All right, so that is my next tip, and that is just selecting your constraint first. And it's not specific to tangent, of course. Any constraint, you can click on it first and then select the entities that you want to constrain. It's a little bit different than what a lot of users do, but I think if you're doing them back to back, it becomes very valuable. The other tip is remember that you're in that command until you escape out of it or click on it again. So it will assume that anything that you click on from that point forward, you're trying to make that constraint. All right, so that is one that will save you some time when creating constraints. Let's move on to the next one. Now, the next tip, I think, has been around in CAD a long, long time. So this is not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a commonly asked question, especially by the more heavy sketching users out there. And that is, how does window select work? When I have a lot of sketch geometry, does it make a difference if I go from right to left or left to right? And this is something that carries over from a lot of CAD applications. So if you're not familiar with what I'm referring to, I'll explain it in a second. But if you've come from AutoCAD or SolidWorks or one of those kinds of CAD applications, this is a familiar concept. When you're in a sketch and you need to select a lot of things at once, I don't want to left-click individually lines. I want to window select maybe a dozen lines and arcs without having to left-click individually. That's where window select comes in. It's essentially a left-click drag. So you left-click drag your cursor over the sketch geometry that you want to highlight. The difference comes in when we talk about the direction that you drag. So a right to left drag, if you drag your cursor from right to left, anything touching the window that you create is selected. Now, if you drag from left to right, anything fully encompassed within that window is selected. And again, this is an important distinction when we talk about really complicated sketches, where you're trying to get exactly so many entities and nothing more or nothing less. That's where this becomes important. But a commonly asked question, is there a difference between selecting right to left, left to right? Yes. Right to left, it's everything touching the window. Left to right, it's everything fully encompassed within that window. Okay. So to give you a simple demo of this, let me jump back in real quickly here to this document. Let's jump into this sketch. And so really all I have here is just a few circles, or a circle and a few rectangles. And if I window select, let's do a right to left. I'm just going to drag a window, left click, drag a window, and I let go. Notice that it selects anything touching it. including these lines. And I didn't fully encompass those lines. It was just simply touching it. However, if I go from left to right, it will only give me what's fully encompassed within that window. So you'll notice these lines, some of the lines stuck outside of the window, therefore isn't highlighted or selected when I went from left to right. So again, right to left to right, you will get different behavior. Okay. All right, so that's my next tip, window select. If you're not familiar with it, window select is just a fast way to select a lot of sketch entities without having to individually select them. If a pattern is used in multiple instances on different planes, can the holes be made into the part and used in each? Can the holes be made into a part and used in each situation? Yeah, sure. You can absolutely create a hole that's a part and then just do a subtract if that's your technique. We actually have a dedicated hole command and a dedicated beams command for steel detailing. Excuse me. But yeah, that is a technique you could use if you chose to. Absolutely. Next tip in my list. Let's jump into it. Dimension as you go. So, as the name implies, this ability allows you to add dimensions on the fly. Now, it's not going to fully define your sketch in the more complex scenarios, of course, but it's just a way to speed things up. And this is, only for those that like the approach, but it's a very fast way of adding a lot of dimensions quickly. And it applies to just about any kind of size geometry. So lines, arcs, circles, rectangles, any type of scenario where you have a size for your geometry, you can enter a value as you're sketching. And I think that's the key thing. So a lot of users are aware of, I sketch my geometry, I click the dimension command, I come back and click on my geometry and add a dimension. But if you can add a dimension on the fly, you can save yourself that going back and forth. And essentially, you're adding a dimension as you sketch. So if I sketch a line, if I sketch a circle, if I sketch an arc, immediately after I place that geometry, if you type in a number and hit enter, it will automatically dimension that geometry. So again, it happens automatically as you're sketching. So if I sketch a line, then type in a number and hit enter, I've sketched a line and dimensioned the length of that line. Okay, so it's a big advantage. Of course, it's not going to give you a fully defined sketch in every scenario, but it will allow you to quickly define the size of things as you're sketching. So to give you a quick demo of this, bear with me for a second here. Let me start. We'll start a new tab up here, new Part Studio, and I'll start sketching. Now, the key again is as you're sketching. So if I click on line, for instance, and I sketch a line, let's go left click. The moment that you place the line, in this example, I've now placed that line, I can enter a value. So I'll type 5, enter, and now I've added a dimension, a distance dimension for the length of that line. And I can keep sketching, so I'm still in the line command. I can say 9, enter, and just keep going, right? 4, enter. And so I'm adding these dimensions on the fly as I'm sketching the geometry. Okay. And it applies to any geometry. So let's say I want a circle, 3, enter, and now I have a dimension for that circle, the size of it. So just keep in mind, again, you can also, by the way, I should mention this rectangle too. In the case of a rectangle, of course, you have 2 dimensions, right? So as soon as you place a rectangle, let's say I want 11 by 5, right? So 11, enter, 5, enter, and now I've added dimensions to give that rectangle a size. So again, the key here, dimension as you go, and you can do this for arcs, ellipses, rectangles, lines, of course. So really useful as a fast way of adding dimensions without having to go back and forth between the dimension command. Okay. All right, so moving on, the next tip in my list, and that is waking up inferences. This is definitely a preferred one. Questions. Is there a way to automatically trace the edges of an imported graphic instead of taking the time to create a sketch over the imported picture? No. You today, as you mentioned, need to import the picture into a sketch and trace over that geometry. So there's not a faster way currently. Questions. Are rectangles and Onshape groups of lines and not a single entity? That is correct. And that's a deliberate decision. And that's so that you could easily sketch a rectangle, delete a piece of it, and still have all the geometry, all the references in place, the constraints in place. So it is worth pointing out when you create a rectangle, you're really just creating 4 lines with a certain relationship to one another. And that is a deliberate thing so that you could go in and delete a piece of it without breaking all of it. In this drawing with the link, you'll have to forgive me. I won't have time to look at a specific model of yours. If you have a question on something specifically, but I won't have time during the webinar to get into a specific design. Forgive me. Okay, so as I mentioned, waking up references. So this is a big one if you are doing a lot of more complex sketches where you find yourself constantly needing to add relationships to other pieces of the sketch. Let me give you an example of this. So in this simple revolve profile that I want to construct, as I'm sketching geometry, you'll get references to other things automatically pop up. So this is vertical. I can have horizontal. I can even get things like perpendicular. But what you'll run into is there'll be scenarios where you need to create a constraint to other things. For instance, I want to create a constraint now to that point over here on the right. But you can see as I move my line down, it's not popping up. So some inferences are automatic. They're going to pop up just as you sketch over the origin and things like that. But there will be scenarios like this one where I want to reference that point, but it's not popping up. How do I wake it up? And this is a term I refer to as waking up the reference. And the answer to that is you move your cursor over that point, stay there for just a moment, then move your cursor back, and what you'll notice is that inference will then appear. And you can do this with anything. I can do it with midpoints. I can do it with a whole bunch of things. So it becomes a very useful way to go in and add constraints. Here's another example. I want this to be horizontal to the one on the right. I'll move my cursor over that point, wake up that reference, and now I have my horizontal inference. The big thing it saves you here is just not having to come back and add these constraints manually later on. So here I can see another reference that I need to this point, move over it, move up, and now I have those inferences in place. Okay. Now, another example of this that I often like to show, let me give you a simple example of it, but you can imagine a number of different scenarios. Let's say that I had like a corner rectangle, and I want to reference the center point. Now, of course, we have a center point rectangle, but imagine any scenario you had where you wanted to reference the center of 2 points and maybe add a point between them, right? In this example, let's say that I want to add a point. I can select point, move my cursor along these lines until that midpoint wakes up. You can see it there. If I move it over here, you can see it there. Now I've woken up both midpoints. And now I can easily constrain to those 2 points. Left click, and now I've placed a point right on the exact center, right? So again, the key thing to keep in mind, you can wake up other geometry just by moving your cursor over it, hovering over it for a second will wake it up, and it's useful when you need to constrain to it later. And it's useful in a number of different scenarios, whether you're trying to, sketch geometry like lines, like I was doing a second ago, or maybe I'm just trying to center one circle on another, or trying to find the center of 2 edges. All of those examples, you don't have to sketch geometry and then manually add constraints. You can wake up the references and create the constraints as you're sketching. And I think that's the big tip. Question: how does Onshape show overdefined? Anything immediately overdefined will show up as red flags in the sketch geometry. So as soon as you have something overdefined, a red flag will appear for that overdefined constraint. Wake up may help with my question about the center of a slot. Yes, and the center of an arc is another good example where you might use wake up. So again, keep in mind, waking up references, you can wake up just about anything and use it and not have to constrain it manually later. I think that's the main thing. All right, so moving on. Next tip that I have, and I don't really have a big example for this, but I just want to stress it because it often comes up. You can insert sketches into assemblies. And the reason I think a lot of users ask this is they like the ability to lay out a sketch or lay out an assembly based on a sketch. And it's a commonly asked question: can I insert a sketch and then start mating my parts to that sketch and use it as a way to drive everything? And the answer is yes. So you can insert a sketch into an assembly. You can mate parts to sketch geometry in your assembly. And you can also use in-context relationships, which is we just announced, to build off of it. I can literally modify parts based on a layout sketch and have the layout sketch drive not just the location of parts, but the size of the geometry as well. So really a lot of potential here, a lot of stuff that I don't really have a lot of time to get into detail into, but I do want to mention that it's possible. At the assembly level, you can have sketches, you can insert sketches, you can mate to them, you can use them to drive geometry in the form of in-context relationships. All kinds of very cool stuff is possible when we talk about, sketches and assemblies. So if you're familiar with this technique, or if you've ever been interested in the idea of having a sketch drive assembly position or parts or even the size, definitely consider it. Okay. So, by the way, I should mention it's just an option. So when you go to insert, you'll see a little icon for sketches. And if you click it, you'll be able to select a sketch and insert it into your assembly. All right, so moving on, that's inserting sketches into the assembly. Now, the next one that I want to mention is the Shift key, and this is a popular keyboard shortcut for the heavy user, oftentimes because showing all the constraints can really be cumbersome. If you know what I'm referring to, I just mean that, in a sketch, if you check show all constraints, it's going to add every constraint. And if you have dozens, even hundreds, that can be a lot of stuff on the screen. And so, a more, seasoned user will recognize, hey, I can mouse over an individual piece and see the constraints for just that piece. The problem becomes when I try to mouse over the actual constraint icon. That can be, sometimes if you move your cursor in just the right way, the icon disappears and you struggle to click on it. So the tip is hold down the Shift key and it will lock all the constraints on the screen, right? So I mentioned before, and this is just to illustrate that, a rectangle is really just a series of lines. If you check show constraints, you can see this is all the constraints I created by just creating a center point rectangle. Right, so you can see there's parallel constraints between these two lines, parallel between these, coincident constraints to tie the endpoints together. So if I wanted a different shape, I could easily break these. I have a horizontal constraint, so if I wanted a rectangle at an angle, I could easily just delete this and drag that up. My point in this is there will be scenarios where this is too much, where if I check show constraints, there's just too much stuff on the screen and it makes it hard to find what I'm looking for. So the tip is, of course, as you move your cursor over, you'll see the constraint icons appear. Sometimes they can be difficult to select. And so the tip is, if you move your cursor over, the icons appear. If you hold the Shift key down, as soon as you see those icons, it locks them on the screen no matter where you move the cursor, right? So I can move the cursor way over here and they're still there, right? And the big thing is they don't disappear immediately after. Right? They stay on the screen longer, allowing you to click on them. So again, the tip, use the Shift key when you're mousing over geometry to lock those icons on the screen, making it easy to click on them. A simple example like this may not be as relevant, but imagine that you had dozens of lines and arcs. It can be difficult to find the exact one you're looking for, and often show constraints really can even confuse things when you have a lot of constraints. Okay. All right, so moving on, the next one in my list, and this is another commonly asked question. What about dimensioning to the inside or the outside of an arc or a circle? If I click on the center points, obviously I get a dimension to the center points, but how do I dimension to the outside of the arc in Onshape or to the inside of the arc? And the answer is actually pretty simple. You click on that part of the arc when you're creating a dimension. So if I wanted a dimension from the outside edge of two arcs, I would click on the farthest extent of that circle that I could, and then click on the other farthest extent of the circle, and that would give me a dimension from the inside or the outsides. If I want, a dimension from the insides, I would click on the closest point that I could, and I'll show you what I mean by this. The tip is you can do it. It works just fine for the inside or outside of arcs or circles, and it's just a matter of clicking on that part of the arc when you're creating your sketch. So let's do this. Let's add a few circles here. Okay. And what I'd like to do is, of course, add a dimension between those two circles. Now, if I click center point to center point, I get a dimension between the two center points, of course, which is what a lot of users are looking for. But the question then becomes, well, what if I want from outside to outside? And I can left click the outside, left click the outside, and now I get a dimension from the outside. Notice that I clicked on the outside of those circles when creating the dimension. So that's a key part of it. It recognizes where on the circle you clicked. And that also means if you want on the inside, it'd be inside to inside, you get an inside dimension. And this applies to arcs just the same as it is to these circles that I'm sketching. But the key thing is it recognizes where on the geometry that you clicked, and it will give you a dimension from the closest point that makes sense, right? The inside or the outside. So a big tip, especially if you do a lot of dimensioning, and a lot of users that do this like the ability to dimension to the outside of the arc or the inside. All right, moving on. The next one in my list, we only have a few left, and this is slots. And this is something that a lot of users I still see constructing them manually, and you can do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but there is a dedicated command for doing this. And it works in a very similar way to offset, which I was showing you a second ago, but it gives you dedicated slot capabilities. It creates an arc on the ends. It offsets in both directions evenly. So it gives you that nice slot, behavior. The things I want to stress is you can create a slot around almost any geometry, lines, arcs, no circles, I take that back, but arcs, rectangles, right? Because rectangle is really just a series of lines. You're going to get an arc for each line, but even things like splines, you can create a slot around them. So jumping into it here, let's get into a few examples. So as I mentioned before, you can use almost anything as a reference. So here I have a line, a rectangle, an arc, and a spline. And I click the slot command. It's under the offset command in the toolbar. So I click slot, and then I just click on any geometry that I want to create a slot out of. So if this simple line is what I want, I left click, and now I have a slot around that line. I can double click the dimension. Let's change this to 1 inch. Now I have a 1 inch slot around that. And I can keep going. So I can left click here, and there's a 1 inch slot. I can left click each line of this rectangle, for example, and create my slot around that. I can even use a spline as the reference for a slot. Okay. So just keep in mind you can use just about anything as a reference. Now the question came earlier, can I go, I believe the question was, can I go in both directions using a center point to drive the slot? And I don't believe there's going to be, it would be in the construction of the geometry that's referenced from the slot. And I think that the slot itself is really just offsetting what you already have. You could use a center point arc in the example like this and get something like that. So forgive me if I'm not giving you a total answer. I'm not 100% certain we can do exactly what you're looking for. All right, so moving on, that is the slot command. Again, you'll find it under offset in the sketch toolbar, and you can use just about anything as a reference. So just left click the geometry, then we'll create a slot and prompt you for a value, double click the dimension, and you can change it. All right, next one. What is an application for a slot? Well, I mean, any kind of slot you'd need to create. An example would be, I'm designing a vise and I need a slot where my bolt can slide back and forth so that it has the room to line up with a certain other part, for example. So, any time of, think of any scenario where you have a bolt that needs to slide along a certain amount of travel, that would be a good application for a slot. All right, moving on. The next two that I have, the last two that I have for you, are really kind of the same, and they're both, I think, the biggest tips that I can give you, especially when we talk about sketching. And, the first is just the keyboard shortcuts. And I can't stress this enough. I've given this tip a number of times, but if you're not using keyboard shortcuts, you really should be. It makes a huge difference. And if you're not using as many keyboard shortcuts as possible, you really should be, because there's a lot of things that you can do to save yourself some time with keyboard shortcuts. So to give you a simple demo of this, I always like to show this because I think, a lot of users can really miss out on an opportunity to save some time with these keyboard shortcuts. So, if I want a line, I type L, and now I'm sketching a line. If I want a construction line, I can then hit Q, and now I'm sketching a construction line, right? I can click Q again, and now I'm back to a solid line. I can hit the C key on the keyboard, now I'm in a circle, right? I can hit the R key on the keyboard, now I'm in a rectangle. And so now I can, go really quickly between commands. I can add constraints quickly. I can line, circle, T key, and now I have a tangent constraint, right? Line, circle, T key, there's another tangent constraint, right? I can go point, circle, I for coincident, right? Or, so a big tip is all of the keyboard shortcuts. They make a big difference for creating the sketch geometry and also constraining it. Now, a big tip, if you're interested, what are the various constraints and what are the different keyboard shortcuts? Just move your mouse over one of the constraints for a moment and leave it there, and you'll see a tooltip, and you can see it says coincident and then I. If I move down, concentric, let's go to parallel, B, right? Tangent, T. So anything with a keyboard shortcut will show that keyboard shortcut in the flyout menu. Now, if you want to see all the keyboard shortcuts, you'll find them under the help menu. So help, keyboard shortcuts, and this is all of them for not just sketching, but part studios, drawings, assemblies. So keyboard shortcuts are a tip you can use throughout Onshape. I think they're really, really valuable in sketching, especially as the user gets more and more advanced. I think the amount of time that you save is really big. A commonly asked question, can you print the keyboard shortcuts or can you move them out to a separate window? Yes, if you click this arrow in the top right, it becomes a separate window in your browser, and you can print that, you can move it to a separate monitor, you can do just about anything you'd like, right? You can right click and print it and so on. So just keep in mind, the keyboard shortcuts are probably one of my biggest tips for just really increasing the speed of your sketching. It's probably one of the single biggest things you can do to sketch faster. All right, so moving on, my last tip, and this is a keyboard shortcut, but I think the one that's a little bit different than the rest, and that is the S key on the keyboard. The S key on the keyboard will bring up what's called the shortcut toolbar. The shortcut toolbar appears at your cursor. So the neat thing is, this is essentially a toolbar that you can bring up at any moment, immediately wherever your cursor is. You don't have to go back up to the toolbar. The other neat thing about this toolbar is you can customize what's in it. So if you find yourself always doing a certain command, a slot command, I'm always doing that, I can add that to my toolbar, and now every time I tap S on the keyboard while I'm in a sketch, it's right there. I don't have to go up to the command. So this is especially useful if it doesn't have a keyboard shortcut, the command that you're looking for, or if I just have this common 10 sketch tools that I always use, I can add them to this toolbar and have an easy way to get to them. The big thing is, just means that you don't have to spend a lot of time going back and forth between sketch and command. All right, so let me give you a simple example of this. Let me jump into a sketch here. So I'm in a sketch. That's, of course, an important detail. I hit the S key. Now, my shortcut toolbar while in a sketch has extrude, a common command, but then I have lines, rectangles, circles, arcs, splines, convert entities, another common one, trim, dimension, the things you'd expect to see. So again, anywhere I'm at, if I'm in here sketching, I hit S, there's my toolbar, right? And if I'm over here, S, it pops up wherever my cursor is. So I don't have to go back and forth. Now, the big thing with this is just saving you the mouse travel, but inevitably the user ends up asking, how do I customize this? How do I change what's in this toolbar? And you could do that under your preferences. So under Manage Account Preferences. So in the top right corner, you have your username. If you click Manage Account, go to Preferences, you'll find all of your preferences. And this is more than just the toolbar. It's view manipulation, it's, reversing scroll direction, all those kinds of, high level settings that you may want to control. If I scroll down a bit, I can see shortcut toolbars and, more importantly, sketch. So here I can scroll through. Let's say that I'm always creating an ellipse. I can check ellipse, and now I've added the ellipse to my shortcut toolbar, and now I can get to it really quickly. One last thing I want to mention, make sure to click Save Shortcut Toolbar Settings before you go back into your document. But that's my last tip for you. Definitely a big one if you are a fan of keyboard shortcuts. The S key is a really, really useful one, really useful keyboard shortcut. So I see that there are quite a few questions left. I'm going to stick around and answer all those questions, so bear with me. I know that there are quite a few. I do have one final question for the audience, so if you could bear with me for a moment. I'm interested in, is there any users out there that are interested in a private demo or discussion with one of our Onshape account managers? I really encourage you to reach out to one of our account managers. They can talk to you more specifically about how Onshape applies to what you're doing, and some of the commands or tools or things that they can give you some insight on that can help in your application. So if you're interested in talking to one of our account managers, let us know. I will make sure we have one of them reach out to you. But that's what I had planned. I know that there are a lot of questions, so bear with me. I will stick around to make sure that every one of your questions are answered. I'm going to go ahead and close things out here, and I want to say thank you, everyone. Again, if you have questions, stick around. But otherwise, thank you, everyone, and have a good day.